Hey, my name is Extravaganza Grotesca, and I welcome you all back. The other day, I did one of those guided tours around a graveyard in Madrid. You know, one of those tours in where they tell you ghost stories and scary stories that happened around the graveyard. And they told us a story that I didn't know about. So I was like, hey, this is really interesting, so I need to do some more research on that one. And as soon as I did it, I was like, I need to share this because it is really good. So this happened in Our Lady of Almudena Cemetery, which is the largest cemetery in Madrid and one of the largest cemeteries in Western Europe. It opened its gates in 1884 and it has around 5 million people buried within its walls. It's so big that it has 2 bus lines that go from one end to another one because people get lost inside it. And it is really beautiful. So if you have the chance to visit it when you come to Madrid, please do so. Anyway, this really beautiful graveyard is going to be the main setting of the story that I'm going to be telling you today. Francisco García Escalero was born on the 24th of May in 1954. He lived with his parents and his brother in a little house only 200 meters away from this cemetery. I gotta say that around that time, that area wasn't a very nice one. He was a lonely kid, some kind of like a weirdo, because mainly he spent his time just wandering around the graveyard and he even skipped school in order to do so, which it is wrong that I'm saying this because I used to do the same thing. In fact, I still do it. But anyway, because of this, he kind of like grew up being obsessed with death and he definitely felt more comfortable amongst the gravestones than amongst people. This could be because he was convinced that people were constantly following him and that they were always talking bad about him behind his back. So he started developing these kind of like suicidal tendencies, and when he was around 12 years old, he threw himself in front of a car. Plot twist, he survived. At 14, he ran away from his house and he started drinking alcohol while wandering the streets of Madrid, as well as the ones in the graveyard. He loved going into like abandoned houses, which I do too. And he started spying on loving couples while touching himself in the shadows. That was weird. So that's when he also began his criminal career. In 1973, just after getting freed from jail because of a robbery misdemeanor, he was again arrested for assaulting a couple that were just visiting his beloved Almudena Cemetery. This was serious because he beat up the boy and he raped the girl. For this, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison, and that was the starting point on his descent into madness, and that definitely shaped one of the worst serial killers in Spanish history. His mental health got really bad during his time in prison, and because he was feeling very lonely, he liked keeping the corpses of little birds and other small animals in his cell with him in order to keep him company. Because, picture this, he was just trapped in this cell with his own delusions, so he was like, yeah, let's just get a pet, even if he's dead. He also covered himself in death-themed tattoos, and people said that he had a tattoo that said, "Born to Suffer," which I think is quite a good sentence, because aren't we all? In 1984, he got released from prison, and as soon as he did that, he had really good intentions. He really wanted to get reinserted in society and get a proper life and get a job and all that jazz. However, the voices in his head had a different plan for him. A year later, his dad died, and I couldn't find any information about any other family that he may have. So assuming that he was all alone in the world now. So basically what he did, he just started begging for money on the streets of Madrid and spending all the money that he could on alcohol. So picture this. He was all alone in the world, living in the streets, begging for money, drunk day and night. And he had voices in his head that didn't have the nicest thoughts. So obviously all of this was just a recipe for disaster. On the 11th of November 1987, Escalero committed his first murder. His victim was a woman that also lived on the streets. He drugged her, he stabbed her several times, he decapitated her, and then he raped her once she was definitely dead. This would mark the modus operandi that he would follow during the entire of his criminal career. What he would do is that he would become friends with another person that lived on the streets like him. They would get drunk together, have a good time, get his trust, and then he would use whatever sharp object that he would have in hand in order to stab them and kill them. Sometimes he would add minor changes to his ritual, like for example, sometimes he would extract the insides of his victims, maybe to eat or something, I don't know. He would also cut the fingertips, and sometimes, most of the times, he burned the body. So I guess he did that in order to make it more difficult to identify the body. So somehow, maybe he knew what he was doing. The thing is that, don't forget, he was hearing voices in his head and they weren't nice voices. So, maybe it was just an explosion of violence because of the alcohol and these voices, or maybe he just wanted to do it. Remember how I was telling you how beautiful is Our Lady of Almudena graveyard? Well, he also thought it was really beautiful, so what he did sometimes is that he would carry the burned corpses all the way from the point in where he killed them to the graveyard, and he would put them in a hole that he would previously dug for this purpose. So somehow he was kind of like burying his victims in his favorite place in the world, so that's sweet, isn't it? The thing is that he also liked to desecrate graves from the recently deceased and have sex with the corpses, and that's not very nice. You would be thinking, how was that even possible? How did no one saw him or anything? But keep in mind that back in the 80s, graveyard security wasn't really a thing, and because this cemetery is so big, he was just able to do it without anyone noticing what he was doing. All of his victims were people like him that were living on the streets and had no family, or maybe the family didn't even know where they were. So sometimes it took quite a while before anyone would report a missing person, if it happened at all, and even when police discovered some of the bodies, there was no real connection between the corpses and Escalero, so, there was nothing that would suggest that he could be a killer, so he just kept doing it for years. Truth is that because of his erratic behavior and, the way he was all the time around the cemetery, and all that jazz, police did send him away to a psychiatric hospital in Madrid a few times, but he was very quickly released all of them times because, there was no reason for them to keep him there, really, so he was just back on the streets. However, apparently, sometimes when he was in the hospital, he confessed having committed some murders to the nurses and to the staff and even to some doctors, but nobody believed him. The staff at the hospital just thought that he was just a poor man that was a bit loopy and that maybe he just wanted some attention, or maybe, I don't know, he was just making up some stories. So nobody took the confession seriously. At the same time, corpses, or whatever remained of them, from people that lived on the streets, kept appearing around Madrid. They were all mutilated, sometimes decapitated, sometimes they were burned, and even one time in 1989, they found a body with its amputated penis inside of its own mouth. So it was clear that the violence of the crimes kept just escalating, and there was no suspect in sight. So police were getting really worried, like, all right, there's someone, brutally killing people around Madrid, and we literally have no clue of who can be, the killer. This would change in October of 1993. Escalero was once again at the hospital, like he sometimes was. But this time was different because he had a roommate. And one night, he and his roommate, who was called Victor, decided that they wanted to go out to have a party, so they escaped from the hospital. They go out to the streets of Madrid, they got some money, they bought alcohol, they got really drunk together, they were having a blast, they were like, yeah, cool, you're my friend, whatever. Problem. 48 hours later, the lifeless body of Victor was found near a church in Madrid. Church that is really close to my house, by the way. His head had been violently crushed, and his body had been burned after he was dead. This was the first time that the police were like, hey, why don't we reach out to this guy Escalero? Because, they knew that he had escaped the hospital with Victor, and they were like, even if he's not a suspect yet, maybe he was the last person that saw Victor alive. So let's just go out there and look for him to try to interrogate him. Luckily for the police, they didn't have to look for too long. A few days later, Escalero tried to commit suicide again by throwing himself in front of a car again. And again, he survived. So he was rushed to the hospital. Once in the hospital, he was okay. I don't know how, but he was fairly okay. And like he did in the past, he started confessing to having committed some crimes. Only this time, the nurses and the doctors took him seriously, and they called the police. The police got there, and they arrested him. Once he was at the police station, he just literally confessed having committed 14 crimes. He was like, yeah, I've killed 14 people. Not one or two, 14. However, police could only confirm 11 of those victims, mainly because the rest of the bodies either were never found or the remains couldn't be identified. This didn't stop Escalero from being very, very detailed when telling the police how he killed his victims, where he killed them, and everything that, he just did. I bet he was like, okay, now someone's listening to me, so, I want to just tell you the whole story. And that's what he did.
La cogí, la llevé y luego la maté, la corté la cabeza.
A uno le cortaste la cabeza, ¿qué más cosas hacía?
Le corté la cabeza y a otro le saqué el corazón.
¿Le sacaste el corazón?
Sí, y mordí un trozo. Mordí un trozo. Me metí en el cementerio de Almudena y me había bebido un litro de coñac. Tomé como un pastilla acompañado. Y recuerdo que me metí dentro del cementerio y desenterré tres nichos, los rompí y saqué los cuerpos. Que me atraía mucho a mí los velatorios y los cementerios. A ver a los muertos y me ponía yo en la misma postura que ellos durmiendo. En los velatorios, cuando no había vigilante. Y me ponía yo allí, lo mismo que se disparan ellos, me ponía en la misma postura. Y que ellos me atraía a mí.
¿Te atrae la muerte?
La muerte me atrae.
¿Te gustaría morirte?
Pues sí.
¿Sí?
Sí.
¿Por qué?
Pues yo ya no me encuentro yo en condiciones ya de estar en esta vida. Una persona que tenía que acabar mal, como me ha pasado.
One thing he was very persistent about. He said that he didn't want to kill anyone, but it was the voices in his head telling to do so. He said that every time he killed someone, those voices would stop for a little bit, and that he had to do it because he just wanted some mental peace. But he didn't want to do it, he just had to. In February 1996, he was found guilty of 11 counts of first-degree murder. And he was sentenced to 30 years in prison, which is the maximum sentence that you can get in Spain for murder. However, he was acquitted under the reason of insanity due to his mental illness. He was seen by a doctor, and they found out that he had schizophrenia, among having other mental problems as well. So instead of being sent into a normal prison, he was sent to a prison mental institution. Apparently, once he got there, he started having the proper treatment and taking the medication that he needed to take. He never had another violent episode ever again. He was even described as being really nice and gentle. I mean, he was a murderer and he killed a lot of people, you know, and that is really wrong. But at the same time, I feel like maybe if he had gotten a proper treatment, you know, for the illness that he had, maybe things had gone in a different way, or maybe not. Maybe he would have done the same things because he just wanted to kill people because he was evil. In the end, he spent the rest of his life in this mental institution, and he died in 2014 by asphyxiating with a plum pit, which I find it pretty ironic because he tried to commit suicide a few times and he was doing all sorts of like dangerous things and he was drinking a lot, and in the end he just died by accidentally choking himself with a little bone of a fruit. I mean, maybe it was karma, who knows. And this is the story of the beggar slayer, which is the nickname that he was given because all his victims were people that lived on the streets just like him. So if you have the chance to come and visit Our Lady of Almudena Cemetery, remember this story when walking around the gravestones. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Please do subscribe if you want more horror movie, true crime content, and I'll see you all next time.